My name is Mary Bunch, and I'm an associate professor at York University. As an academic, my background is in critical theory. So I studied at the Center for the Study of Theory and Criticism at Western University, and I specialized in sort of the intersections of queer and critical disability and feminist and post-colonial theory. I'm really interested in the way those things interact. And I didn't really begin my art practice until I ended up landing at the Department of Cinema and Media Arts at York University. And I've always been really interested in the way that art is another kind of knowledge, another way of knowing. So it really provided me an opportunity and also the tools and the resources to be able to start exploring the kinds of concepts that I'm concerned with through the image and through, particularly because I'm in media arts, through the media arts image. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in a little while, but I'm really interested in the virtual and how that operates as a kind of aspect of reality. And personally, Dolene Tsawiyashi Manning, who's my collaborator on this project, is my life partner as well as my collaborator. So I've been involved in Indigenous community through her and her community and her family for over 20 years. And so my sort of one of my primary motivating interests is justice in the area of colonization and understanding how the way we think and the way that we can imagine the kinds of possible worlds we might have translate into action and social change. So this project for me is also a way of having a conversation with Dolene's Indigenous ontologies that she's developing as a philosopher and trying to figure out how that conversation can happen between settlers and Indigenous peoples in a way that's not appropriating Indigenous philosophies to kind of solve world problems, but being open to being moved by those philosophies and being in dialogue with them in order to do things differently in our world. So the work, the way that we conceptualized it at the outset was Dolene wanted to make a work that kind of instantiates her philosophy of Nadeau worlding that she's been developing. She was developing as part of her dissertation, but she's really been thinking about her whole life. And I don't want to talk about Nadeau worlding because she's going to do an interview with you and talk to you about that. So I'll just be really brief about it and then talk about my part of that conversation. So Nadeau worlding is a relational ontology where she's looking at how existence is comprised of animated kind of energies or potencies or potentials. And so it's a really different way of approaching the fabric of reality itself than the way that we approach it in the West. One of the kind of key concepts within that concept is this idea of this kind of spirit as a potency or potential. And so as somebody who's working in media arts and who's in this conversation between queer theory and critical disability studies and decolonial studies and the kind of media that I work with, I was really interested in how the concept of the virtual, when you take it up in philosophy, is it translates, its etymology comes from the notion of potency and strength. Brian Masumi talks about this in some of the work that he does. So when we talk about virtual reality, we often talk about virtualization, the kind of simulated reality. But when we talk about the virtual, it's not a simulation of reality. It's not kind of the opposite of reality. It's like kind of an aspect of reality that's the potential aspect of reality. So the virtual is what is possible, but hasn't yet been realized. And so, I mean, this operates really powerfully in the way Dolene's thinking, but it also has trajectories that come into Western thought. And it's a way that we can find a pathway into a conversation that is like authentically between us and not a one-sided conversation that's the West and its kind of universalizing tendencies, or a conversation that kind of tries to extract Indigenous knowledge and just apply it out of its context. Yeah, it's been a bit of a journey for sure. Darlene and I weren't working in virtual reality. We were moving towards it. It was something that we had been thinking about getting involved in. But during COVID, we had started teaching in Second Life, in the virtual world of Second Life, which is kind of ancient as far as sort of game worlds go. It was developed in the early 2000s, and it's a really archaic kind of coded world, but it's also really user-friendly and easy to use. And you can kind of go in, and there's these basic building tools, and you can, have your avatar just wave an arm, and a mountain rises before you. So we've been kind of building worlds with our classes as a way of, as an alternative educational space when everybody was teaching in Zoom. And because we've been working in that, Joel Ong, who is the director of the Sensorium, who's also an artist in this exhibition, asked if we were interested in kind of taking what we were developing in that realm and doing something in Mozilla Hubs. And not really knowing anything about Mozilla Hubs, but being, kind of like happy to say yes to things, we said yes, and then figured out what we had to do. So we learned, Mozilla Hubs has a kind of building studio called Spoke. It's a consumer, easy to use kind of virtual reality platform where with very, very, very minimal media arts skills, you can create virtual reality spaces. And as it happened, Second Life had given us those rudimentary media art skills that we needed, how to use a basic building tool. The tool looked very, very similar in Mozilla Hubs. So we watched a few YouTube videos and we started playing around in that world. And Darlene was talking about, thinking of Nadeau, I'm interested in the microscopic. So we went and found some microscopic images online and brought them into Spoke and started manipulating them and stretching them and building rooms out of them and walls out of them. And eventually we figured out that there was a 360 tool where you could take a flat image and turn it into a spherical image. And at that point, we started really conceptualizing this universe of microscopic creatures, and we were able to build it by ourselves. And Joel's team came in with his world builder expert and just kind of tweaked it a little bit at the end so that it was stable. And we had that exhibition. But it was sufficient for that exhibition, which was 2 days long, but the program was too glitchy and it wouldn't stay stable. So then we started thinking about switching into Unreal. And we have a talented pool of graduate students at York in cinema and media arts that we were able to work with. So we worked with a team of media artists, Michaela Panakanova, George de Oliveira. We now have Galit Ariel working on it. So they kind of constructed the environment within Unreal and sort of recreated what we had built in Mozilla Hubs, but better and more beautiful and more stable. I do think it's within the capacity of art, and I think it's one of the really important jobs that art does, is that it speaks to us through the language of the image instead of the language of the idea. And sometimes it merges the idea and the image, and I'm really interested in art that has a conceptual base, which I think the work in this show, like all of the works in this show do. I think the image, it has an impact on the way humans can imagine possibility. And there's a whole literature on the social imaginary that talks about, when they talk about the hegemonic ideas, the way that the ideas of the ruling class kind of becomes a dominant perspective that even people that aren't served by that interest kind of hold it as being common sense or true. The imaginary is a similar kind of operation in which the images of what appears to be possible for us kind of permeate our imaginations. And when I teach world making to my classes, I often teach it in a very political way. And my students are trying to imagine anti-capitalist worlds or decolonized worlds, and they find themselves, even though they believe in those kinds of worlds and their ideas are very attached to those worlds, when it comes to actually imagining them, they find themselves frustrated and empty. And I think one of the roles that art does is it provides us those images. Artists do the work of imagining the impossible, and then filling our minds or our spirits, I guess, with those possibilities. They give us the capacity to go beyond the actual of what is around us, and to be able to bring something new into the world. In early iterations of the work, we went online and found microscopic images. And there's just gorgeous microscopic images out there made with really, really high-powered telescopes. And we were playing around with those. But we wanted to build towards using our own microscopic images. So to do that, we had to learn how to use a microscope, which I didn't do grade 11 biology or wherever you learn that. So we borrowed a microscope from the school, a video microscope, and we brought it home. And we have lots of nieces and nephews who came over and played with it with us and helped us figure it out. And we would go out with the kids and get samples from the water around us. We live very close to the St. Lawrence River, which we're also kind of interested in because the St. Lawrence is a conduit of colonial encounter. It's the early settlers traveled up through the St. Lawrence into the interior of what today is considered to be Ontario. So it was also kind of a great body of water to be working with. And we figured out how to use that machine with lots of trial and error. And as we were, it was funny because the first times we were looking through it, we'd see what we thought were like, some kind of interesting algae shape or something, and it would just be the cracks in the slide of the microscope, or the edge of the slide of the microscope. And it took us a while to even recognize what we were seeing, and to be able to know where to look and how to find the creatures that are living in these micro worlds of the microscope. And as we got better and better at it, we also realized that there was a kind of searching that had to happen, because some of those creatures were afraid of the light, and of course the light was necessary for us to see it. So it would be almost like we were hunting. It'd be like, you'd have the focus, and you'd have the thing that moves the stage around, and we'd be like this combination of moving those things and changing the focus, which also changes the depth of field. And so there was all these layers of reality that became perceptible to us, that as Dolene was looking through it, was also like, spoke to her about the kind of what she calls Nadeau knowing, or in her philosophy, she talks about the way that we perceive reality and the limits to the way we perceive reality. And in Western thought, we think of, often what our senses give us access to, the phenomenological world around us, is what we believe is the real world. And when we talk about anything that's beyond those senses, it starts seeming kind of flaky or romanticized or something. But with the microscope and the depth of field, it started giving us ways of thinking about what came into perception for us, what was not in our visual field as just not being perceptible, because we could adjust it and make it perceptible. So it made us think about the world around us in different kinds of ways. So that was pretty exciting.